when my wealthy, estranged grandmother stared at my baby's faded, hand-me-down blanket and asked why $250,000 a month wasn't keeping us warm, my world fractured. I'm Maureen, 29, an archival book conservator who knows how to spot a counterfeit page. My mother and uncle thought I was too humble to ever ask questions, but they didn't know I was about to rewrite our family's entire history. The damp, biting cold of an Astoria winter has a way of creeping through the floorboards of a rented coastal cottage, no matter how many rolled-up towels you wedge under the doors. I sat at my small kitchen table, the wood scarred by years of someone else's lives, holding 3-week-old Leo against my chest. He was wearing a washed-out yellow sleepsuit, 3 sizes too big, that I'd found in a cardboard-free box outside the local community center. In my right hand, I held my favorite bone folder, a smooth, heavy tool made of polished cattle bone that I used to crease delicate, 100-year-old parchment. It was a grounding weight. As an archival conservator, my entire life was about patience. I spent my days removing mold from forgotten diaries, reconstructing and using wheat starch paste to mend tears so seamlessly that you'd never know the paper had ever been broken. I understood that the truth of a document is often hidden in the margins, in the quiet spaces where people think no one is looking. But that morning, my own margins were frayed to the breaking point. My husband had walked out the moment the pregnancy test turned positive, leaving behind nothing but a half-empty box of coffee filters and a stack of overdue utility bills. I was surviving on the meager fees the Astoria Historical Society paid me to restore their water-damaged maritime ledgers. Every dollar was a calculated battle. I knew exactly how many ounces of generic formula I could buy if I skipped lunch. If you've ever sat at a kitchen table with a calculator, counting pennies while your baby sleeps, you know the hollow, scraping feeling in the pit of your stomach. You know the shame that shouldn't be yours to carry, but is. I know some of you are doing that exact, desperate math right now. Stay with me, because the ledger always balances in the end. The silence of the foggy morning was shattered by the heavy, authoritative thud of a car door closing outside. I pulled the thin, peeled wool shawl tighter around Leo and looked through the salt-crusted kitchen window. A sleek, midnight black Lincoln Town car was idling in my gravel driveway, its exhaust pluming like white smoke in the freezing Oregon air. A driver in a crisp dark suit stood by the passenger door, holding a massive black umbrella over a woman who stepped out with the posture of a monarch. It was Eleanor Vance, my maternal grandmother. She was 81 years old, the matriarch of the Vance Timber Fortuna woman who owned thousands of acres of Douglas fir stands stretching from the Cascade foothills to the Pacific shoreline. We hadn't spoken in 5 years. When I chose to study paper conservation instead of marrying the junior partner of her preferred law firm, my mother, Jillian, and my uncle, Marcus, had smoothly assured me that Eleanor had washed her hands of me entirely. They told me I was cut off, a disappointment who didn't deserve the Vance name, and one, in my youthful pride and hurt, had accepted the exile. Now, Eleanor was walking up my rotting wooden steps. Her custom-tailored gray cashmere coat didn't have a single speck of lint on it. Her silver hair was coiffed into a perfect, frozen wave. She didn't knock. She turned the handle and walked into my cramped kitchen, her sharp, hazel eyes immediately scanning the room. She took in the peeling wallpaper, the single electric space heater humming loudly in the corner, and the smell of boiled cabbage and damped wood. Her gaze landed on me, and then on Leo. Her brow furrowed, deep lines etching themselves around her mouth. It wasn't a look of pity. It was a look of profound, icy displeasure. "Marin," she said, her voice like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "What is the meaning of this theater?" I stood up slowly, supporting Leo's head. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my voice remained steady. "Hello, grandmother. If you're here to criticize my housekeeping, I'm afraid I don't have the energy for it today." Eleanor took a step closer, her leather gloves clicking against the strap of her handbag. She reached out with one gloved finger and touched the edge of Leo's faded blanket. "Is this a joke? Are you trying to make a point to the press? Or is this some bizarre, modern parenting philosophy where you raise my great-grandson like a peasant?" I stared at her, genuinely bewildered. "A point to the press? Grandmother, I'm trying to keep my son warm. I work 60 hours a week when I can get the contracts. And right now, this is what I can afford. Eleanor's eyes narrowed into slits. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Do not play the martyr with me, young lady. I have many faults. But I am not a fool. I authorized the release of the Vance family trust funds the day Marcus informed me of your pregnancy. I have signed the authorization sheets myself every single month. She stepped back, her voice rising in genuine anger. Wasn't that $250,000 a month enough for you to buy a decent roof over this child's head? Or have you thrown it all away on some foolish investments? Speak to me, Marin. The room went dead silent, save for the rattle of the space heater. My jaw dropped. The bone folder slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the worn linoleum floor. I looked at the polished white tool, then back up at the formidable woman standing in my kitchen. $250,000, I whispered. My throat felt as dry as ancient papyrus. Grandmother, I have never received a single dollar from you. Not when I was pregnant, not when Leo was born. Not ever. Eleanor froze. The anger on her face didn't fade. It transformed into something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating stillness. She was a woman who had run a timber empire in a man's world for 40 years. She knew the scent of a lie. What did you say? She asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. I have $15.42 in my checking account right now, I said, looking her dead in the eyes. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, hot and stinging, but I didn't brush it away. My mother told me you called Leo a mistake. Uncle Marcus sent me a registered letter 3 months ago, warning me that if I ever tried to contact you for money, you would file a restraining order. I've been surviving on food stamps and whatever paper restoration work I can do at night while the baby sleeps. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind howling off the Columbia River, rattling the loose glass in the windowpane. Eleanor's face went pale. The proud, untouchable matriarch suddenly looked her age. She looked at my red, chapped hands. She looked at the cheap, plastic bottle of generic formula sitting on the counter. She looked at the genuine, exhausted despair in my eyes. She realized, in an instant, that she had been lied to, and more importantly, she realized who had done the lying. Jillian, Eleanor whispered, the name of her own daughter tasting like poison on her tongue. And Marcus. She closed her eyes for a brief second, her chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled breath. When she opened them, the fragile elderly woman was gone. The titan of industry was back, and there was a terrifying fire behind her hazel eyes. Without a word to me, Eleanor reached into her cashmere coat and pulled out a sleek, gold-plated smartphone. Her fingers, though slightly arthritic, moved with absolute, lethal precision. She pressed a speed dial button and put the phone to her ear. She didn't wait for a greeting. Arthur, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the cold air of my kitchen like a bandsaw through pine. Get the entire executive board of Vance Timber on a secure line. And call our lead forensic accountants. I want a full audit of the family trust disbursement accounts for the last 12 months. Yes, immediately. She paused, listening to the voice on the other end, her eyes locked onto mine with a fierce, protective intensity I had never seen from her before. And Arthur, Eleanor added, her voice dropping to a register that made my spine tingle. Draft a freeze order on all accounts associated with my daughter Jillian and my nephew Marcus. If they so much as buy a cup of coffee on a company card in the next hour, I want to know about it. We have a parasite in the house. She hung up the phone and slipped it back into her pocket. She looked at me, then down at Leo, who had just opened his tiny, sleepy eyes. Marin, she said softly, the harshness completely gone from her tone. Pack your things. We are going to Portland. I looked around my drafty little kitchen, at the piles of old books, the worn-out blankets, and the bone folder lying on the floor. I reached down, picked up the tool, and slid it into my pocket. The story of my family was about to be restored, and I was going to make sure every single tear was laid bare. The transition from my freezing drafty kitchen to the plush leather interior of Eleanor's Lincoln town car was so jarring it made my head spin. I sat in the back seat, holding Leo tightly against my chest, wrapped in his thin, faded yellow blanket. The car smelled of expensive leather, peppermint, and the faint, clean scent of cedarwood that always seemed to cling to my grandmother. Outside, the rain began to fall in heavy gray sheets, blurring the jagged Oregon coastline as we sped away from us. Eleanor sat beside me in perfect, rigid silence. She didn't offer a comforting pat on my knee, nor did she make empty promises. That wasn't her way. Instead, she stared out the window, her jaw set so tight I could see the faint pulse throbbing in her temple. But every few minutes, her eyes would slide down to Leo, watching the quiet rise and fall of his chest. I looked down at my own lap. My fingernails were short and clean, but the skin around them was dry and cracked from hours of working with archival solvents and cold water. In my coat pocket, my fingers closed around my cattlebone folder. It was a simple, smooth tool, used to coax stubborn fibers of centuries-old paper back into alignment. It felt real. It felt honest. If you've ever had your own flesh and blood look you in the eyes and tell you that you are nothing, that you are a disappointment, a burden, a drain on the family name while they are quietly pocketing the very air you need to breathe, then you know the specific, hollow ache in my chest right now. You know the dizziness of realizing your entire life has been orchestrated to keep you small, hungry, and silent. Some of you might be sitting in that silence today, wondering if you're crazy for feeling like something is deeply, terribly wrong. You aren't crazy. Trust your gut. The truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how much dirt they throw over it. We didn't go to the towering, glass-fronted headquarters of Vance Timber in downtown Portland. Eleanor was far too smart for that. She knew that Marcus and Gillian had spent years installing their own loyalists in those offices. Instead, the driver took us to a quiet tree-lined street in the historic Irvington district, stopping in front of a modest two-story brick carriage house. This was Eleanor's private sanctuary, the place where she kept her personal archives. The original hand-drawn logging maps from the 1940s and the private ledgers of the Vance family. Waiting for us inside was Arthur. Arthur was 74, with a crown of fluffy white hair and thick, wire-rimmed glasses that slid constantly down his nose. He was the family's retired chief legal counsel, a man who had walked Eleanor through the grief of losing her husband and the complex restructuring of her empire. He didn't work for the corporation anymore. He worked only for Eleanor. When Arthur saw me walk through the door, carrying Leo in his cheap, oversized sleep suit, his eyes watered behind his thick lenses. He had known me since I was a little girl sitting under the drafting tables, drawing trees on scrap blueprint paper. "Maureen, my dear," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with genuine emotion. He stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to touch Leo's tiny, sleeping hand. "Look at him. He's beautiful. I am so sorry we didn't know. If I had had any inkling." "It's not your fault, Arthur," Primera sighed softly, sitting down on a sturdy green-cushioned wooden chair near a crackling radiator. The warmth of the room hit my face, and for a second, my eyes grew heavy with the bone-deep fatigue of a nursing mother who hadn't slept more than 3 consecutive hours in a month. "We have work to do." Eleanor took off her leather gloves, placing them neatly on a heavy pine work table. "Arthur, tell me we have the physical files. I don't want digital summaries that can be manipulated or deleted from a remote server. I want the paper." "I have them right here, Eleanor," Arthur said, his tone turning instantly professional, though his eyes still burned with a quiet, protective fury. He gestured to 3 large, heavy-duty cardboard banker's boxers sitting on the table. "These are the physical disbursement vouchers and the monthly compliance certificates for the Vance Family Trust. Subaccount 7. The account created specifically for Marin and her descendants." My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. Subaccount 7. $250,000 a month, $3 million a year. Enough to buy a home, to secure Leo's education, to pay for medical care, to live without the constant, choking fear of eviction. I stood up, gently transferring the sleeping Leo into a warm, flannel-lined basket Arthur had thoughtfully prepared with a soft wool blanket. I walked over to the table. This was my territory. This was paper. "Arthur," I said, my voice steadying as my professional training took over. "What are the requirements for releasing these funds every month?" Arthur pulled a heavy, leather-bound folder from the first box. "According to the trust bylaws, established by your grandfather, because you chose a path outside the family business, the funds are held in a restricted discretionary account. To prevent frivolous waste. Those were your grandfather's words. I'm afraid the trustee must submit a monthly physical voucher. This voucher must be signed by the trustee, Luis Marcus, confirming the funds are being used for your housing, healthcare, and living expenses. And, most importantly, it must be co-signed by you, the beneficiary, acknowledging receipt of the previous month's a physical signature, I whispered. Every single month. Yes, Arthur said, his face grim. If the beneficiary's signature is missing or disputed, the funds are immediately frozen and returned to the main corporate treasury. Marcus has submitted these signed vouchers on the 1st of every month for the last year. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my magnifying loupe, a small, heavy brass lens I used to inspect the fiber structures of historic documents. Let me see them. Arthur laid out 12 white sheets of high-grade, 70-pound bond paper. These were the monthly compliance certificates. At the bottom of each page were 3 signature lines. Eleanor Vance as the trust grantor, Marcus Vance as the trustee, and Maren Van School as the beneficiary. I leaned over the table, placing the loupe against the signature on the oldest document, dated 11 months ago. My mother and uncle had always thought of my job as a joke. They called me a glorified paper cleaner, a hobbyist who spent her time playing with old garbage. They had no idea that my entire career was built on the science of detection. I knew how ink behaved when it met cellulose. I knew how the human hand naturally hesitates when it is trying to copy a line that isn't its own. Under the magnifying lens, my signature looked perfect. It had the slight, left-lining slant I had used since high school. It had the sharp cross on the T and the soft rounded loop of the M, but as I moved the loop across the ink line, my breath caught. What is it, Maren? Eleanor asked, leaning over the table, her hazel eyes fixed on my face. It's too perfect, I said, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. Look at the ink distribution. When a human being writes, the pressure of the hand varies. The downstrokes are slightly darker, holding more ink, while the upstrokes are thinner and lighter. There is a natural rhythm, a flow. But this line, the ink depth is completely uniform throughout the entire signature. I picked up the document and held it up to the warm, yellow light of the desk lamp. And there's no indentation on the back of the page. Even with a light hand, a ballpoint or roller ball pen leaves a microscopic groove in 70-pound paper. This paper is completely flat. What does that mean? Arthur asked, though I could see from his pale face that he already knew the answer. It's an autopen, I said, a cold, hard certainty settling into my bones. A high-end programmable signature machine. Someone took a high-resolution scan of my signature from my old college trust fund documents, loaded it into a plotter, and had a machine sign these vouchers. It's why every single signature on these 12 documents is identical down to the 10th of a millimeter. I looked at my grandmother. Humans can't write the exact same signature twice. Grandmother, the muscle twitch, the angle of the wrist, the texture of the deskit always creates minute variations. These 12 signatures are clones. Eleanor's hand closed into a tight, pale fist. And Marcus has the only authorized autopan machine for corporate signing in his private office at the Timber headquarters. But that's only half of it, I continued, my heart racing as I dug deeper into the boxers. I pulled out the bank routing receipts attached to the back of the vouchers. The trust didn't send this money to my personal checking account. Look at the routing numbers. The funds were transferred monthly to an account at Cascade Merchants Bank under the name MV Conservation Services LLC. Marcus's initials, Arthur growled, his eyes flashing with disgust. And he used your professional background as a front. He set up a shell company using your initials to make the trust auditors think the money was going to your business. I leaned against the heavy pine table, my hands trembling slightly as the sheer scale of the theft washed over me. $3 million. While I was counting pennies for baby formula, while I was wrapping my newborn child in a hand-me-down blanket from a free box, my own mother and my uncle were using my name to steal $3 million. They had left me to starve in a drafty cottage, hoping I would be too proud, too broken, and too isolated to ever ask questions. They wanted me to stay hidden in the margins of the family story, a forgotten footnote. But they had forgotten one simple rule of paper conservation. You can try to erase the past. You can try to write over it with false ink, but the original fibers of the page always remember where they were bent. I looked at Eleanor, and for the first time in 5 years, I saw a reflection of my own quiet, stubborn strength in her ancient, beautiful face. "Grandmother," I said, my voice low and steady. "How do you want to handle this?" Eleanor reached out, her cool, soft hand finally resting over mine. "We are not going to file a police report, Marin. Not yet. A police report is too quiet. It gets handled by deputies and junior district attorneys behind closed doors." She looked down at the forged documents, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying, ancient light. "My daughter and my nephew have forgotten who built the foundation of this family," Eleanor said softly. "They think I am an old woman waiting to die, and they think you are a girl who can be swept under the rug. We are going to show them that the wood we are made of does not rot so easily." She turned to Arthur. "Arthur, call the trustees. Tell them I am calling an emergency family meeting at the Portland estate tomorrow night. Tell them it is to discuss the final distribution of my personal estate before the end of the fiscal year." Arthur smiled, a slow, grim expression that showed every one of his 74 years of legal cunning. "They'll run to get there. They won't want to miss a single scrap of the inheritance." "Let them run," Eleanor whispered. "And, Marin, my dear, bring your magnifying loupe." I looked over at Leo, who had just let out a soft, contented sigh in his sleep, completely unaware of the storm that was gathering to protect him. "We had to wait. In my line of work, waiting is 70% of the job. You cannot rush the drying of wheat starch paste. If you do, the paper warps. It bucles. It ruins the spine forever. You have to let the moisture leave the fibers at its own natural pace, under the gentle, steady pressure of a heavy weight." That night, in the quiet warmth of Eleanor's Irvington carriage house, we were the weight. The steam radiator hissed softly in the corner, a comforting, rhythmic sound that felt a world away from the howling wind of my Astoria cottage. Arthur had cleared off a corner of the heavy pine work table to set up a small, temporary nursery for Leo. He had found an old, beautifully carved wooden cradle in the carriage house, a tequan that my own mother had slept in 55 years ago, and lined it with fresh, organic cotton sheets his assistant had rushed over from a local boutique. Leo was sleeping deeply, his tiny fist pressed against his cheek. He was still wearing the faded yellow sleepsuit, but for the first time in his short life, his cheeks were rosy and warm. He didn't have to fight the draft. I sat at the table, a simple ceramic mug of chamomile tea warming my chapped hands. Arthur was hunched over a stack of corporate ledgers, his gold-rimmed glasses perched on the very tip of his nose, while Eleanor stood by the window, staring out into the dark, rain-slicked street. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the pine table. The screen lit up. Mom. My hand shook as I reached for it. The sudden vibration felt like an electric shock running up my arm. I looked up at Eleanor. She didn't move a muscle, but her hazel eyes turned to flint as she gave me a slow, encouraging nod. "Answer it, Marin," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the radiator. "Let her show you who she really is." I took a deep breath, swiped the screen, and put the phone to my ear. "Hello, Mom." "Marin," Gillian's voice came through, sharp, breathless, and accompanied by the faint, clinking background noise of a high-end restaurant. "Arthur's office just sent out an emergency notice. Your grandmother is calling a mandatory family meeting tomorrow night at the Portland estate. What do you know about this?" "Nothing," I said, letting my voice sound as small, tired, and defeated as possible. I reached into my pocket and squeezed the smooth edge of my cattlebone folder, letting the hard object dig into my palm to keep myself grounded. "I'm in Astoria, Mom. Leo has a cold, and my space heater keeps shorting out. I haven't heard from grandmother in years. You know that." An audible, heavy sigh of relief came through the line. Good. Thank God," Gillian said, her tone instantly shifting from panicked to patronizing. "Marcus was worried you'd somehow gotten to her. Listen to me, Marin. If anyone from Eleanor's office contacts you, you tell them you're doing fine. You tell them you don't need anything. If you ruin this meeting for us, I swear to you, I will make sure you never get a single book-cleaning contract in this state again." My throat tightened. If you've ever had to pretend everything is fine while you're secretly building the cage to trap the monster, you know how heavy the air in your lungs feels at that exact moment. You know the absolute disgust of realizing that the person who gave you life views you only as a threat to her comfort. I know some of you have had to play dumb just to survive a predator. Stay, steady. The trap only works if they believe they've already won. Mom, I whispered, letting a genuine tear slip down my cheek. I don't have enough money for groceries next week. Leo needs diapers. Can you please just lend me $100? Just until I finish the maritime ledgers. A short, sharp laugh came through the speaker. Honestly, Marin, you made your bed when you chose that ridiculous dusty hobby over a real career. I don't have cash to throw down a black hole. Ask your food stamp office. I have to go. My dinner is getting cold. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone and set it on the table. The silence in the carriage house was absolute. Eleanor hadn't moved from the window, but her jaw was set so tight I could see the muscles in her neck straining. She has always been greedy, Eleanor said softly, her voice dangerously calm. But I did not realize she was cruel. Greed makes people sloppy, Eleanor, Arthur said, sliding a heavy blue-covered legal binder across the table toward us. And Marcus has been very sloppy. He's been using the Vance Timber corporate line of credit to secure personal real estate acquisitions in Southern Oregon. He's over-leveraged. He needs cash, and he needs it immediately to cover the margins before the annual corporate audit next month, which is why they will both run to this meeting, I said, my professional focus returning. They think you're about to carve up the remaining personal estate. Exactly, Arthur agreed, tapping his finger on the blue binder. Here's the trap. I have drafted an omnibus, trust, reconciliation, and liability release agreement. It's a standard document we use when restructuring family trusts. To receive their share of the new estate distribution, Marcus and Jillian must sign this document. And what does the document say, Arthur? I asked, leaning in. It contains a clause, Arthur said, a grim, brilliant smile spreading across his wrinkled face. A clause where they explicitly declare, under penalty of perjury, that all prior trust accounts under their stewardship, specifically Vance Family Trust, subaccount 7F, been fully, accurately, and legally disbursed to the designated beneficiary. They must swear that you have received every single dollar and that they have no outstanding financial liabilities to you. The genius of the plan washed over me. If they signed the document to get their hands on the new money, they would be legally certifying their own fraud on a fresh, binding contract. They would be signing their names directly beneath a lie. Hours after we had secured the physical evidence of the forged AutoPen signatures and the shell company bank routing sheets, they wouldn't just be civilly liable. They would be walking themselves directly into a federal grand jury indictment for wire fraud, bank fraud, and grand larceny. And if they refuse to sign Primera Ashkid, they won't, Eleanor said, stepping away from the window. Marcus cannot afford to refuse. If he doesn't get his hands on the final distribution funds by Friday, his Southern Oregon development will collapse, and the bank will foreclose on his personal assets. He will sign whatever Arthur puts in front of him. His own greed is the rope we are going to hang him with. She walked over to the cradle, looking down at Leo. She reached out and gently, with a hand that had once signed the deeds to half the timberland in the state, tucked the soft wool blanket around his shoulders. Marin, she said, looking up at me, your mother and uncle have spent a year treating you like you don't exist. They thought they could leave you in the cold, while they warmed themselves by a fire bought with your money. Tomorrow, we are going to turn off the heat. The next day passed in a blur of meticulous preparation. While Arthur finalized the legal documents, I didn't sit idly by. I went to work with the tools I knew best. I took the 12 forged compliance certificates and carefully placed them inside individual, archival-grade mylar sleeves. I used my heavy brass paperweights to keep them perfectly flat, organizing them chronologically in a slim, black leather portfolio. I didn't use flashy folders or expensive corporate binders. I wanted the presentation to look exactly like what it was. A clean, undeniable forensic record of a crime. I packed my magnifying loupe, my bone folder, and a high-resolution printout of the Cascade Merchants Bank routing transactions for MV Conservation Services LLC. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the Portland air crisp, cold, and smelling of damp pine. Arthur's driver loaded our small bags into the back of the Lincoln. I dressed Leo in a simple, clean white cotton onesie Arthur's assistant had bought, wrapping him in a beautiful, thick forest green wool blanket that Eleanor had kept from my own childhood. As we climbed into the back of the sleek black car, I looked down at my own clothes. I hadn't bought anything new. I wore my simple, dark gray wool sweater and my worn leather boots. I wanted them to see exactly who I was. I didn't need their luxury to have dignity. The drive up into the exclusive Portland Heights neighborhood was quiet. The houses grew larger, set back behind towering Douglas firs and wrought iron gates. This was the world I had walked away from 5 years ago, a world of quiet, manicured wealth that hid a rot deeper than any water-damaged ledger I had ever restored. The Vance estate was a massive Tudor-style stone mansion built in the 1920s. Its leaded glass windows glowed with warm, golden light, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. As the Lincoln pulled up to the grand stone portico, I saw 2 other luxury SUVs already parked in the driveway. A sleek Porsche Cayenne belonging to my mother and a heavy, silver Range Rover belonging to my uncle Marcus. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a wild, fluttering panic that threatened to choke me. I looked down at Leo, who was sleeping peacefully in my arms, his face soft and innocent against the green wool. Eleanor reached across the leather seat and laid her hand over mine. Her grip was surprisingly strong, dry, and rock-steady. "Dignity, Marin," she said, her hazel eyes locking onto mine with absolute unwavering authority. "You are a Vance. You do not bow your head to thieves." I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the hard weight of the bone folder in my coat pocket. "I'm ready, grandmother," I said. The driver opened the door, and we stepped out into the biting evening air, walking together toward the heavy oak doors of the house that built our family. The heavy oak double doors of the Portland Heights estate did not creak when they opened. They swung back with a silent, oiled precision that felt more like the entrance to a vault than a home. The air inside the grand foyer was thick with the scent of beeswax polish, expensive wood smoke, and the faint, bitter undertone of damp wool from the rain that had started to fall again outside. I held Leo tightly against my chest, his small body wrapped in the thick forest green wool blanket. Beneath my worn leather boots, the Persian rugs felt impossibly plush, a stark contrast to the curling linoleum of my kitchen in us. I could feel the shape of the cattlebone folder in my coat pocket, a hard, reassuring ridge against my thigh. It was my anchor. Eleanor walked ahead of us, her silver-headed cane striking the hardwood floor with a rhythmic, demanding asterisk thud dash, thud dash, thud, asterisk. Arthur followed close behind, carrying his battered leather briefcase like a shield. As we approached the double doors of the library, the sound of laughter drifted out, brittle and fueled by expensive alcohol. It was my mother's laugh, a sound I had spent my entire life trying to please, trying to earn, and eventually trying to escape. "I'm telling you, Marcus, she's finally going to hand over the Southern Oregon timber rights," Jillian was saying, her voice dripping with champagne-soaked satisfaction. "She's 81. She doesn't have the stomach for the winter board meetings anymore." "She'd better," Marcus's deep, gravelly voice replied. "The bank is breathing down my neck about the Klamath Falls development. If we don't get the signature release by Friday, the whole house of cards goes up." Eleanor didn't knock. She simply pushed the heavy doors open with the tip of her cane. The laughter in the room died instantly. Gillian was standing by the massive stone fireplace, a crystal tumbler of scotch resting in her manicured hand. She was wearing a cream-colored silk blouse and a gold chain that looked heavy enough to anchor a small boat. Marcus was leaned against the edge of a massive mahogany desk, his custom-tailored Italian suit jacket unbuttoned, his silver-templed hair perfectly styled. When their eyes fell on Eleanor, they both smiled wide, practiced smiles of filial devotion. But as their gaze shifted to Arthur, and then to me, the smiles froze on their faces like wet plaster. "Marin," Jillian's voice pitched upward, a sharp, ugly note cutting through the warm air of the library. She set her glass down on the mantelpiece with a loud asterisk, clink asterisk. "What on earth are you doing here?" "And what is that?" "That asterisk thing," Asterisk you're holding? She looked at Leo as if he were a wet dog I had dragged in from the street. His name is Leah, Mother, I said, my voice low and steady. I didn't yell. I didn't shake. I felt a strange, icy calm washing over me. The same focus I felt when I was working on a document so fragile that a single sudden movement could destroy it forever. He is your grandson. And we are here because grandmother invited us. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in my faded gray sweater and my worn boots. Mother, what is the meaning of this? This is a private family meeting to discuss the restructuring of the corporate holdings. Marin has nothing to do with Vance Timber. She chose her path years ago. Why is she bringing her domestic problems into this office? Eleanor didn't answer him. She walked slowly to the head of the long, polished oak conference table that sat in the center of the library. She pulled out the heavy armchair, her movements deliberate and royal, and sat down. She rested both hands on the silver head of her cane. Sit, Eleanor commanded. It was a single word, spoken softly, but it had the weight of 40 years of corporate empire behind it. Marcus and Gillian exchanged a quick, tense look, but they walked to the table and sat down. Arthur took his place to Eleanor's right, opening his briefcase with a crisp, professional snap. I sat at the far end of the table, placing the green wool bundle of Leo gently in my lap. He let out a soft, sleeping sigh, completely undisturbed by the tension vibrating through the room. Arthur, Eleanor said, her eyes never leaving her son's face. Present the agreement. Arthur slid two identical, thick documents bound in blue paper across the polished wood. The words asterisk omnibus, trust, reconciliation and liability, release agreement asterisk, were printed in bold black letters across the cover. Marcus's eyes lit up. I saw the muscle in his jaw relax as he saw the legal headings. To him, this was the moment he had been waiting for, the release of the final trust assets, the money that would save him from his creditors. This is the standard reconciliation, Arthur explained, his voice dry and neutral. Before we can proceed with the final distribution of the personal estate, we must close out all active Marcus, as the managing trustee, and Gillian, as the cosigner, you must execute this document. It certifies that all prior trust disbursements have been fully, accurately, and legally settled with no outstanding liabilities. Marcus snatched up his gold fountain pen before Arthur had even finished speaking. Of course, standard operating procedure. We've managed the trust accounts with absolute integrity, Mother. Every dollar has been accounted for. He flipped to the signature page, his fingers moving with a desperate, greedy speed. He signed his name with a flourish, the wet black ink catching the light of the chandelier. He passed the pen to Gillian, who signed her name right beneath her heavy gold bracelets clinking against the polished wood of the table. There, Gillian said, sliding the document back to Arthur with a smug, dismissive look in my direction. Now that the boring paperwork is out of the way, can we please have the driver take Marin back to whatever hole she's living in? The smell of damp wool is giving me a headache. If you have ever sat in a room and watched the people who are supposed to protect you sign away your life with a smile on their faces, you know the absolute stillness that comes over you. You don't feel anger anymore. You feel a cold, brilliant clarity. I know some of you have sat across from a spouse, a parent, or a boss who thought you were too weak to fight back, watching them sign their own doom while they thought they were signing yours. Stay with me. This is where the ink dries. I reached into my bag and pulled out the slim, black leather portfolio. I laid it flat on the table. Before we close those accounts, Uncle Marcus, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a sharp blade, we need to talk about sub-account 7. Marcus's hand paused as he reached for his glass of scotch. What are you talking about? Sub-account 7 is a restricted discretionary fund. It's been managed perfectly. I have 12 physical compliance certificates here, I said, opening the portfolio. I carefully slid the first 3 Millersleeve documents across the table, stopping them directly in front of him. Every single one of them bears my signature, certifying that I received $250,000 a month for the last year. $3 million in total. Gillian laughed, a sharp, defensive sound. Well, there you have it. You've been paid a fortune, Marin. If you've thrown it away on your little book cleaning projects, that's your own fault. You have no right to come here begging for more. I didn't receive a single dollar, Mom, I said, looking her dead in the eyes. I've been living on food stamps in a cottage with no heat. My son is wearing hand-me-downs from a free box. Oh, please, Marcus sneered, though I saw a bead of sweat break out along his hairline. You're lying. You probably hid the money in an offshore account to try and extort more from your grandmother. Those are your signatures, Marin. They've been audited by the corporate compliance team. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy brass magnifying loupe. I set it down on top of the first mylar sleeve, directly over my signature. I am an archival book conservator, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that filled the entire room. My entire career is built on the science of ink and paper. I know how a pen behaves when it touches cellulose. I gestured to the loupe. Look through the glass. Marcus didn't move. He sat frozen, his face turning a strange mottled gray. Look at it, Eleanor suddenly roared, slamming her cane against the floor with a force that made the crystal glasses on the mantelpiece ring. Marcus flinched. With a shaking hand, he leaned over the table and pressed his eye to the magnifying loupe. When a human being signs their name, I explained, my voice steady and academic, the hand naturally hesitates. The pressure varies. The ink depth is uneven. But under this lens, you can see that the ink distribution on all 12 of these documents is completely uniform. There is no variation in line width. There is no microscopic indentation on the back of the 70-pound paper. I looked at Gillian, who was staring at her brother with a sudden, dawning terror. It's an AutoPen signature, I said. A high-resolution digital plot of my signature programmed into a corporate signing machine, and there is only one authorized AutoPen in the Vance Timber headquarters. It sits in your private office, Marcus. This is ridiculous, Marcus shouted, slamming his hand on the table as he stood up. This is a cheap forensic trick. You're trying to ruin me over a technicality. It's not a technicality, Marcus, Arthur said softly, sliding a second set of papers across the table. These are the bank routing receipts for sub-account 7. The funds were not sent to Marin. They were transferred monthly to an account at Cascade Merchants Bank under the name MV Conservation Services LLC. A shell company registered to your private home address. Arthur looked up, his eyes cold behind his wire-rimmed glasses. And you, Gillian, co-signed every single one of those transfer authorizations as the trust compliance officer. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of my uncle and the soft, rhythmic breathing of my baby in my lap. Gillian's face had gone completely white. She looked at the signed omnibus agreement sitting in front of Arthur, and then she looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, animal panic. We had to, Eleanor, Gillian stammered, her voice cracking as she reached out toward her mother. Marcus was in trouble. The Klamath Falls project. We were going to put the money back. We were just borrowing it. Marin didn't need it. She was living so simply, anyway. You left my grandson's child to starve in the winter, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a register that was so quiet, so cold, it made my spine tingle. You forged my signature. You forged her signature. And you stole $3 million from your own blood. She looked down at the freshly signed omnibus agreement. And just minutes ago, Eleanor whispered, you both signed a legal document under penalty of perjury, certifying that all funds had been legally and fully dispersed to Marin. You just handed us the final, notarized confession of your own fraud. Marcus sank back into his chair, his head falling into his hands. The proud, powerful timber executive looked suddenly small, broken, and utterly defeated. I looked at my mother, who was weeping silently into her silk sleeve. And then I looked down at Leo. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the smooth, honest weight of my bone folder. The ink was dry, the pages were restored, and the truth was finally written in a hand they could never erase. The silence in the library didn't shatter. It dissolved into the pathesia wet sound of my mother's weeping. Gillian sat with her head in her hands, her heavy gold bracelets clinking against the polished mahogany table like miniature chains. Marcus was frozen, staring at the blue-bound agreement he had signed so eagerly just minutes before. His signature, once a proud flourish of corporate power, now looked like a self-inflicted wound on the page. Eleanor didn't look at them with anger. That was the most terrifying part. Her hazel eyes held only a profound, weary detachment. She had spent 81 years building an empire, and she was watching two of its branches rot in real time. You will sign the transfer deeds for the Klamath Falls property over to the Vance Foundation by tomorrow morning, Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a quiet, rhythmic cadence. And you, Jillian, will resign from your position as Trust Compliance Officer immediately. Arthur has the paperwork prepared. Mother? Please? Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. If I lose Klamath Falls, the bank will take everything. I'll be ruined. Then you will be ruined, Eleanor replied, her tone as cold and unyielding as the winter ground. But you will not be a thief in my house. You will make full restitution to Marin's trust, dollar for dollar, even if you have to sell your cars, your homes, and your shares in Vance Timber to do it. If you fail to cooperate, Arthur will hand the forensic audit and the forged vouchers to the federal prosecutor before the banks open on Friday. I watched them. I thought I would feel a surge of triumph, a burning heat of victory, but all I felt was a quiet, heavy sadness. If you've ever had to draw a hard line against the people who raised you, you know that victory doesn't taste like champagne. It tastes like copper and cold rain. It's the feeling of finally recognizing that some relationships are too damaged to ever be restored, no matter how much paste you apply to the tears. Arthur stepped forward, his aged fingers sliding to more documents out of his leather briefcase. These were the formal resignation letters and the restitution schedules. With a trembling hand, Marcus picked up his gold fountain pen again. But this time there was no flourish. His hand shook so violently that the nib scratched against the paper, leaving a tiny, jagged line of black ink before he forced himself to sign. Jillian followed, her tears smudging the ink of her own name. Arthur will oversee the liquidation of your personal assets, Eleanor continued, her voice steady and absolute. The $3 million will be returned to Subaccount 7. But it will no longer be a discretionary fund. Arthur and Marin will be the sole co-trustees. You will have no access, no oversight, and no claim to any portion of the Vance estate when I pass. You have spent your inheritance early, and you spent it on lies. When they finally left the library, they didn't look at me. They slunk out of the room, like shadows slipping away from the light. The heavy oak doors closed behind them, and for the first time in my life, the air in my family's house felt clean. Eleanor turned to me, her sharp eyes softening as she looked at Leo, who had finally opened his tiny, dark eyes. She reached out, her cool, soft hand resting on his cheek. He has your father's eyes, Marin, she said softly. But he has our strength. Let us go home. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in quiet, systematic dismantling. Arthur worked with the quiet, methodical precision of a surgeon. Marcus was forced to liquidate his private real estate holdings, selling off his silver Range Rover and his luxury condominium in Portland to repay the $3 million he had stolen. Jillian was quietly removed from the family foundation, her generous expense accounts canceled, her influence stripped away until she was left with nothing but her own bitter reflection in her empty mansion. They weren't sent to prison. Eleanor, in her measured wisdom, knew that a public trial would only drag Leo's name through the mud of local gossip columns. Instead, she chose a punishment that was far more painful for people of their vanity, complete absolute obscurity. They were cut off, stripped of their titles, and exiled to the margins of the family history they had tried so hard to manipulate. As for me, I didn't take the $3 million and buy a penthouse in the city. I didn't buy designer clothes or flashy cars. That isn't who I am. I stayed in us, but I moved out of the drafty, rotting rental cottage with a small, sensible portion of the trust funds. I bought a modest, century-old craftsman home on a hill overlooking the Columbia River. It had thick, cedar-shingled walls that kept out the biting Pacific wind, and a wraparound porch where I could sit and watch the cargo ships glide through the fog. The best part of the house was the detached carriage house in the back, which I converted into my dream conservation studio. I spent my days surrounded by the things that grounded me. The smell of organic wheat starch paste, the dry, clean scent of acid-free blotter paper, and the soft hum of a high-end humidifier, keeping the room at a perfect 50% moisture level. I bought a beautiful cast-iron book press from the 1890s, its heavy wheel turning with a satisfying, solid weight under my hands. And Leo was always there, sleeping in his sturdy wooden cradle near my workbench, wrapped in warm, organic cotton blankets. His cheeks were plump and healthy now, no longer chapped by the damp cold. I know some of you are listening to this right now, looking at your own worn-out kitchen tables, your own stack of unpaid bills, and you're waiting for the part where I tell you that money solved everything. I won't lie to you. Having a warm house and knowing that my son's future is secure took a weight off my chest that I didn't even realize I was carrying. It allowed me to breathe. It allowed me to sleep. But money didn't heal the ache of my mother's betrayal. It didn't rewrite the memories of the years she spent telling me I was nothing. If you are sitting in the dark today, nursing a wound left by someone who should have loved you, please hear me. Your worth is not defined by their inability to see you. You are not a mistake, and you are not a burden. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is to stop trying to mend a page that the other person is determined to tear. About 6 months after the meeting in the library, a letter arrived at my studio. It was written on cheap, plain notebook papyrus stark, contrast to the heavy, cream-colored stationery my mother used to favor. The handwriting was shaky, the ink slightly *Marin. The letter read. The house in Portland Heights is gone. I'm living in a small townhouse in Bend. Marcus won't speak to me. I'm sorry about the baby. I'm sorry about everything. I'd like to see him sometime. Just 11. Whose? I held the paper up to the light of my studio lamp, my archival instincts automatically checking the fibers. It was real paper. It was a real flawed human hand behind the pen. I didn't tear it up. But I didn't pack my bags to visit her either. I sat down at my workbench, picked up my favorite fountain pen, and wrote a brief, polite reply. I told her that Leo was doing well, and that perhaps, in time, when the seasons changed and the wounds had finished scarring over, we could meet for a quiet cup of tea in a neutral place. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't a tearful embrace. It was a lukewarm door, left slightly carefully ajar. Because I have learned that while you must set hard boundaries to protect your peace, you must also leave a tiny sliver of space for the possibility of human redemption, not for their sake, but for yours. Eleanor comes to visit us once a month. The sleek, midnight black Lincoln still pulls up my gravel driveway, but these days she doesn't look at my home with displeasure. She walks up my wooden steps, her silver-headed cane tapping against the cedar porch, and she sits in the rocking chair by my wood stove with Leo in her arms. She is 82 now, her grip slightly weaker, but her hazel eyes are as bright and fierce as ever. She watches me work on my books, her face softening as she sees the patience and care I put into every single page. Yesterday, I was working on a heavily damaged family Bible from the late pioneer era. Its spine was completely split, its pages detached and crumbling at the edges. I was using my cattlebone folder to gently, firmly crease a new Japanese tissue hinge along the broken fold. "You have a gift, Marin," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of the wood stove. "You know how to put things back together." "Only the things that are worth saving, grandmother," I replied, looking over at her. Leo let out a bubbly, happy laugh from his cradle, his small hands reaching up toward the warm,